On December 20th, 1922, a surveyor named J.G. Tierney drowned while searching for the ideal spot to build a dam in the Black Canyon of the Colorado River, exactly 13 years later to the day. His son, Patrick Tierney, fell to his death from one of the very intake towers of the finished dam. Between those two deaths, in the driest, hottest, most punishing canyon in the American Southwest, thousands of men dug for tunnels through solid rock, in heat that regularly passed 140 degrees, breathing air thick with truck exhaust, in spaces with almost no ventilation at all. This is the story of how they did it, and how many of them never got the chance to see what they built. The project that would eventually become Hoover Dam began, on paper, years before a single man broke ground in Black Canyon. Congress authorized the Boulder Canyon Project Act in 1928, after decades of catastrophic flooding along the lower Colorado River had convinced federal engineers that the river needed to be controlled at almost any cost, both to prevent disaster downstream and to provide irrigation, water, and electricity to a rapidly growing American Southwest. The contract to actually build the dam was awarded in 1931 to a consortium of 6 construction firms that formally organized themselves under the name 6 Companies Incorporated, specifically to bid on a project of a scale no single firm believed it could handle alone, submitting the winning bid at just under $49 million, an enormous sum for the depths of the Great Depression, and one that came with brutal financial penalties written directly into the contract for every day the project ran behind schedule. By 1931, when construction began in earnest on what was then called the Boulder Canyon Project, the country was deep in the Great Depression, and word of a massive federal construction job on the Colorado River spread across the West like wildfire. Men arrived by the thousands from failed farms, closed factories, and empty mining towns, driving or hitchhiking or riding freight trains into a stretch of desert in Nevada and Arizona, where daytime, summer temperatures in the shade regularly reached 119 degrees Fahrenheit, and inside the unfinished tunnels being carved into the canyon walls, recorded temperatures climbed past 140 degrees. There was no shade in Black Canyon that mattered, there was no relief, and there was a line of desperate men outside the hiring office every single morning, willing to take the job anyway, because the alternative back home was often no work at all. The very first task facing the engineers of 6 companies, the consortium of construction firms awarded the contract to build the dam, was not the dam itself. Before a single bucket of concrete could be poured, the entire Colorado River had to be moved out of the way, diverted around the construction site through a set of tunnels, bored directly through the solid rock walls of the canyon. 4 diversion tunnels were planned, 2 on the Nevada side and 2 on the Arizona side, each one roughly 50 feet in diameter and stretching more than 4,000 feet through rock that in some sections was hard, volcanic, breccia, and in others, crumbling, unstable material that could shift and collapse with almost no warning. Digging tunnels of that scale through a desert canyon on a deadline that 6 companies faced steep financial penalties for missing meant round-the-clock work, 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, with men working practically on top of each other in the dark, the noise, and the heat. The mechanics of digging those tunnels were themselves an assembly line of controlled violence against solid rock. Crews, known as jumbo crews, operated massive, custom-built rigs mounted with dozens of pneumatic drills at once, boring blast holes into the tunnel face in a carefully mapped pattern. Once the jumbo rig was pulled back, powder monkeys packed those holes with dynamite and wired them for a timed sequence of blasts designed. After the dust settled, at least as much as dust can settle in a space with almost no airflow, mucking crews moved in with power shovels and trucks to clear away the shattered rock, hauling it out through the tunnel to be dumped outside, clearing the way for the jumbo rig to roll back in and repeat the entire cycle. A well-drilled crew could advance a tunnel faced by several feet in a single shift, an extraordinary pace for hand and machine excavation through solid rock. But that pace came at a direct physical cost to the men doing it, hour after hour, in air that grew steadily worse as the tunnel grew longer and further from any natural ventilation. Once a tunnel had been fully bored through, the work was still far from finished. Each of the 4 diversion tunnels then had to be lined with concrete along its entire length, a process that required building traveling forms, essentially massive steel molds on wheels that could be moved forward section by section as concrete crews poured and cured the lining behind them, smoothing the rough blasted rock into a finished passage capable of channeling the full force of the Colorado River without eroding away within a few years. That concrete lining work brought its own hazards, since curing concrete releases heat as a natural byproduct of the chemical reaction inside it, adding yet another source of warmth to tunnels that were already unbearable. And cement dust combined with the ever-present exhaust fumes created a haze that made simply breathing through a full shift a genuine physical struggle, long before anyone considered the additional strain of the manual labor itself. Engineers on site also had to account for a phenomenon almost nobody outside the project anticipated: the sheer heat radiating from the surrounding volcanic rock itself, which had absorbed decades of relentless desert sun and released that stored, meaning that even a hypothetical tunnel, with perfect ventilation and electric rather than gasoline equipment, would still have subjected workers to genuinely dangerous ambient temperatures simply from the rock itself. That bad air became one of the most dangerous and most quietly ignored hazards of the entire project. The trucks and shovels used to clear blasted rock from deep inside the tunnels ran on gasoline engines, and gasoline engines produce carbon monoxide, an invisible, odorless gas that displaces oxygen in the bloodstream and, in high enough concentration, kills a man with almost no warning symptoms beyond headache, dizziness, and confusion. Symptoms easily mistaken in a hot, exhausting workplace for simple heat exhaustion. With tunnels running thousands of feet into solid rock and only a single opening at each end for air to move through, exhaust fumes had nowhere to go, and concentrations built up steadily over the course of a long shift, especially deep near the working face, where the trucks operated almost continuously. Workers reported headaches, nausea, and a kind of creeping mental fog that made even simple tasks difficult by the end of a shift. And it was not until conditions grew severe enough to draw outside attention that large exhaust fans were finally installed to force fresh air through the tunnels, a fix that came only after a significant number of men had already suffered the effects of prolonged carbon monoxide exposure. The financial penalty clause in the 6 companies' contract shaped almost every decision made on site, and it shaped them in ways that consistently pushed against worker safety rather than toward it. Every day of delay cost the consortium real money, which meant supervisors were under constant pressure to keep the tunnel crews moving at maximum speed, regardless of heat, air quality, or fatigue, and it meant safety measures that might slow down the drilling and mucking cycle. Things like mandatory rest breaks during the hottest hours of the day, or a full halt to work until exhaust fans could clear a tunnel of built-up fumes, were treated as costs to be minimized rather than protections to be guaranteed. In the summer of 1931, only months into construction, conditions had grown severe enough that a group of tunnel workers organized a strike, walking off the job to demand better wages, cleaner drinking water, and improved ventilation inside the tunnels themselves. 6 companies responded by firing the workers who had organized the walkout and bringing in new labor from the enormous pool of desperate, unemployed men still arriving in the desert every single day looking for work. A labor surplus so large that the company held nearly all of the leverage in any dispute, and the strike collapsed within days without winning any of its core demands. The lesson was not lost on the rest of the workforce. Complaints about heat or air quality inside the tunnels, however serious, were unlikely to change anything, and a man who pushed too hard on the subject risked simply being replaced by the next man in line at the hiring gate. Drinking water itself became a point of serious tension in those early months, since the water initially provided 2 crews working inside the blistering tunnels was drawn directly from the Colorado River without adequate cooling or purification, and it arrived warm, unpleasant, and in quantities that fell well short of what a man laboring in 140-degree heat actually needed to avoid collapse. It took public pressure and the embarrassment of the 1931 strike before 6 companies significantly improved water distribution on site, installing better cooling systems and increasing the number of water stations positioned along the length of each tunnel, a change that measurably reduced heat-related collapses in the months that followed, even as the company continued to insist, for insurance and public relations purposes, that heat had never been a serious hazard on the project to begin with. This is where the story of the Hoover Dam becomes genuinely controversial, in a way that still shapes how the death toll of the project is discussed today. 6 companies faced enormous financial incentive to keep its official industrial accident and death count as low as possible, both for insurance purposes and for public reputation on a high-profile federal project. Company doctors at the site frequently listed cause of death for men who collapsed from carbon monoxide poisoning or extreme heat as pneumonia, rather than an industrial injury, a classification that, crucially, since pneumonia could be argued as a pre-existing or unrelated illness, rather than a workplace hazard. Historians and journalists, who later reviewed hospital and county records, found a suspicious cluster of pneumonia deaths concentrated specifically among men working inside the diversion tunnels during the hottest months of construction, a pattern that strongly suggests a significant number of heat and carbon monoxide deaths were quietly reclassified and never counted in the official industrial fatality figures released by the company or the federal government. The official death toll most commonly cited for the Hoover Dam project stands at 96 men, a number the Bureau of Reclamation itself has acknowledged for decades as almost certainly an undercount. Given the reclassification of deaths, and the fact that fatalities among workers who died from illness after leaving the site, or who died during the earlier survey and preparation years before construction officially began, were often excluded entirely from the count. Some researchers, factoring in those excluded categories, have suggested the true number of deaths connected to the project could run well over 100. Whatever the precise final number, the deaths were spread across nearly every category of hazard imaginable on an industrial project of that scale. In the 1930s, drowning during the early survey years, falls from the canyon walls and the dam structure itself, rock falls, and premature dynamite blasts inside the tunnels, equipment accidents, and the harder to quantify toll of heat and carbon monoxide that the official record deliberately obscured. Working conditions outside the tunnels were only marginally less brutal. The town built to house the workforce, initially a sprawling, unregulated camp of tents and shacks in the open desert, nicknamed Ragtown by the men living there, offered almost no protection from the heat before the federally planned community of Boulder City was completed, and workers were gradually moved into proper housing. In the earliest months of construction, before Boulder City existed, men and their families lived directly in the open desert, with temperatures that made canvas tents nearly unbearable by midday. And several infant and child deaths in Ragtown during that first brutal summer were attributed directly to heat. Even after Boulder City opened, conditions remained harsh by any modern standard, and the dam's daily official newsletter routinely reported the previous day's high temperature, alongside construction progress updates. A small but telling detail of just how central the heat was to daily life on the project. Boulder City itself was built as a fully planned federal town, laid out with wide streets and government buildings, and it stood in stark contrast to the chaos of Ragtown that had preceded it. But it came with its own set of rigid rules that reflected the social attitudes of the era, rather than any purely practical construction need. Gambling and alcohol were formally banned within city limits throughout construction, a restriction enforced far more strictly here than in most company towns of the period. And housing assignments followed a hierarchy that placed engineers and supervisors in relatively comfortable homes with the earliest access to evaporative cooling, while ordinary laborers were more often housed in simpler barrack-style dormitories that offered only marginal relief from the desert heat, even after leaving a punishing shift inside the tunnels. For many single men working the project, especially in the earliest months, before family housing was fully built out, a full night's sleep in bearable temperatures remained almost as difficult to find as safety had been on the job site itself, since desert nights, even after brutally hot days, rarely cooled enough inside uninsulated barracks to allow for genuinely restful sleep before the next pre-dawn shift began. Inside the canyon itself, another specialized and extraordinarily dangerous group of workers operated with almost no connection to the tunnels at all. High scalers, men who dangled from ropes and bosun's chairs, hundreds of feet above the canyon floor, to clear loose rock from the canyon walls before construction could safely proceed beneath them, worked with jackhammers and dynamite while suspended entirely by rope, swinging themselves across the sheer rock face to reach unstable sections that needed to be blasted away before they could fall on crews working below. The work demanded a strange combination of skills rarely found together. The raw physical strength to operate a heavy jackhammer one-handed, while the other hand gripped a rope. The technical precision to place dynamite charges accurately on an unstable rock face without a stable platform to stand on. And an almost total indifference to hanging by a single line hundreds of feet above solid rock. Several high scalers, according to popular accounts from the period, improvised hard hats by dipping cloth caps in tar and letting them harden, an informal precaution that predates the standardized construction hard hat still used industry-wide today, and stands as one of the very few genuine safety innovations to emerge from a project otherwise defined by how little formal protection existed for the men doing the most dangerous work. High scalers became something of a local spectacle even during construction, with tourists and journalists visiting the rim of Black Canyon specifically to watch them work, swinging and spinning on their ropes in a way that, however dangerous, also carried a strange, practiced grace that separated the truly skilled scalers from the men who did not survive their first season on the ropes. Beyond the tunnels and the canyon walls, an enormous support workforce made the entire project possible, largely invisible in most retellings of the Hoover Dam story. Truck drivers hauled blasted rock and construction material around the clock. Mechanics kept an aging and constantly overworked fleet of equipment running under conditions that destroyed engines and tires at a far faster rate than normal, and cooks, laundry workers, and camp staff supported a population that, at its peak, saw more than 5,000 men employed directly on the dam and its surrounding infrastructure at once. Segregation shaped hiring and housing throughout the project as well, reflecting the broader racial attitudes of 1930s America and black workers. When hired at all in the early years of construction, were largely excluded from the tunnel crews and instead assigned to the lowest paid, least skilled positions on site, a pattern that only began to shift, and even then only partially, after sustained pressure from civil rights organizations later in the project's timeline. The tunnels themselves were finally completed ahead of the tightest deadlines 6 companies faced, and in November of 1932, the Colorado River was successfully diverted through the finished passages, clearing the riverbed for the construction of the dam itself to finally begin. The men who had spent months breathing exhaust fumes and working in triple-digit heat to carve those tunnels through solid rock rarely appear by name in the official histories of the project, remembered instead only in the aggregate as the workforce, or the men of 6 companies, a designation that flattens an enormous range of individual sacrifice into a single administrative category. In the diaries and interviews of the men who did survive, of a workforce that understood, going in, that the job asked something close to their absolute physical limit, and that 6 companies would do everything in its power to avoid formally acknowledging what that limit actually cost. When Hoover Dam was formally dedicated in September of 1935, organized American labor and engineering could achieve, even in the depths of economic collapse, a testament to the relentless, round-the-clock pace 6 companies had demanded from its workforce from the very first day. Photographs from the dedication show a finished structure of extraordinary scale, its curved concrete face rising more than 700 feet above the canyon floor. But almost none of the men who had spent months inside the diversion tunnels breathing exhaust fumes in triple-digit heat appear anywhere in the official ceremony or its coverage. Many of them had already moved on to the next construction job by the time the dam was dedicated, chasing whatever large federal project was hiring next, part of an itinerant workforce that the Depression had scattered across the country, from one massive public work site to another, with little opportunity and even less institutional memory to record what any individual man had actually endured on any single job. It would take decades before the full scope of what happened inside those tunnels received any serious public reckoning at all. Researchers and journalists, revisiting county death records in the years and decades following construction, gradually assembled a picture very different from the sanitized version presented by 6 companies and the federal government at the time. One in which heat and carbon monoxide were treated as acceptable operating costs rather than hazards worth halting a multi-million-dollar project to properly address. Today, a memorial at the dam lists the names of the men whose deaths were officially attributed to industrial causes during construction, a modest but permanent acknowledgement of the toll the project took, even as historians continue to note that the true number of men who died as a direct result of conditions inside those tunnels, once the reclassified heat and carbon monoxide deaths are properly counted, almost certainly exceeds what any official plaque or company ledger was ever willing to record. The dam that resulted from their labor remains, nearly a century later, one of the most significant engineering achievements in American history, holding back the Colorado River to create Lake Mead and providing water and electricity to millions of people across the American Southwest. Every account of that achievement that focuses only on the concrete and the turbines leaves out the part of the story that mattered most to the men actually digging the tunnels beneath the canyon walls. The part where heat alone, invisible and unglamorous compared to a dramatic fall or a rock slide, was quietly one of the deadliest forces on the entire job site, and where a company doctor's choice of 2 words on a death certificate could decide whether a family ever received a cent for the loss of the man who fed them. The story of J.G. Tierney and his son Patrick, the surveyor who drowned in 1922 while scouting the dam site, and the iron worker who fell to his death exactly 13 years later, almost to the day, has become the framing device most often used to bookend the entire project, and it is easy to understand why. It offers a clean, almost mythic symmetry, a father and son claimed by the same stretch of canyon, exactly a generation apart. But that neat symmetry is also, in its own way, part of the problem with how this history tends to get told. The Tierneys are remembered by name specifically because their story was dramatic and traceable. A father and son connection, easy to verify and easy to repeat in newspaper retrospectives and tour guide scripts for the better part of a century. The men who collapsed quietly inside a diversion tunnel from carbon monoxide poisoning, or who died of what a company doctor chose to write down as pneumonia rather than heat stroke, left no such clean narrative behind, no symmetry, often not even an accurate cause of death on the record. And it is precisely that lack of a clean story that has allowed their deaths to remain undercounted and, in the popular telling of Hoover Dam's history, functionally forgotten. Remembering this project honestly means remembering both kinds of loss, the dramatic fall from a tower that made it into every history book, and the quiet collapse inside a superheated tunnel that a company doctor and a payroll department made sure never officially happened at all. If a story like this deserves to be remembered, that is exactly what this channel exists to do. Subscribe if you want more of the forgotten, dangerous history behind the things we now take completely for granted.